Hey guys, FilthyRobot here, bringing you the guides, tips, and tricks video. This time we're talking about how to draft in Guilds of Ravnica. All right, so I'm going to break this kind of tutorial down into two parts. The first is going to be a theory piece, and the second is going to be that theory in practice. This first video is going to be me talking about strategies for drafting for Guilds of Ravnica, and then the second associated video will be me actually doing a draft and talking through the picks and talking about what I'm thinking about as I'm doing those picks and other alternatives that you could be taking in those moments. I think both are useful, and I tried recording one where I did both at the same time, but it tends to get lost kind of in the moment, and I really think that breaking them apart is going to help with getting this information across. So this is the first of those. This is the theory piece here. All right, so general strategies for drafting in Guilds of Ravnica. First of all, it's really important to remember that Guilds of Ravnica is designed as basically a 5-color pair set. And what I mean by this is there are synergetic abilities, these things like Surveil or Jumpstart or the like, that are specific to guilds in large part. And then there are all the multicolors and all the dual lands supporting specific guilds. And these guilds are 5-color pairs, as I said: Dimir, which is blue-black; Izzet, which is blue-red; Boros, which is white-red; Selesnya, which is white-green; and Golgari, which is green-black. All of the dual-colored cards are in those colors right now, which means that if you're trying to draft a red-black deck, for example, a Rakdos deck, there isn't a lot to support that. There's no dual lands in your colors, there's no multicolored powerful cards in your colors, and you're losing a lot of the synergy of the actual mechanics that are introduced in this set. That doesn't mean you have to only draft in these colors, but it means the vast majority of your drafts, if you want to keep that power level of your draft up, which is one of the general themes of what you're trying to do in drafting, you're going to be forced into one of those 5 color pairs. It means in this draft, unlike in Dominaria, you're not likely to see very many single-colored decks, monocolored decks, and you're not very likely to see color pairs that are not those particular color pairs. All right, so just remember that as you're picking, because it's going to inform the types of cards you pick. For example, if you pick up your first 3 picks are all very strong red cards, and then you have the choice between a strong green card or a strong blue card, you're almost always going to want to pick the strong blue card because Izzet's a supported color where Cruel is not. Anyways, but we'll get to that in a little bit. All right, so the early picks are really important, and I don't mean just like your first 1 to 3 picks. I mean more like your first like maybe 6 to 10 picks, 6 to 8 picks maybe. And they're really important because it really defines where your deck is going. A lot of the picks after that are going to be about filling in things your deck needs. And maybe you'll switch after pack 1, so maybe you'll switch color combinations after the 15th pick or something like that. But the later in the draft you wait to switch colors, the less playables you get in the color pair you're on. So potentially the harder it is to have very strong cards across the entirety of your deck. So there's a cost associated with staying open too long. But let's talk about the first picks. The first picks of your draft, if you're new to the set or haven't been drafting the set very much, I really recommend you guys look into a first pick guide. You can just Google first pick Guilds of Ravnica, and you'll probably come up with 2 or 3. Pick a reputable source, something like Channel Fireball is a good source, for example, and you'll see that pros who have been doing this for much longer than you or me have been doing this have gone down and sat down and listed what they would consider their first picks. Now, a lot of these are speculative before the format has been played very much. In order to release a guide early on when people are really wanting it, they haven't had a chance to play it all that much. So these might change as the course of the expansion moves on. But they're generally a good starting point. These are the cards that the professional players, the players who do this for a living, have sat down and said, these are the cards that are worth picking first and foremost to build decks around. Now that said, these cards are a little bit subjective. They're going to change across the course of the format, and these are generally designed to be just literally your first couple picks, not your first 7 or 8, more like your first 2 or 3. That's the priority they're in. Okay, but after you picked your first card or first couple cards, you need to start thinking about what you're doing. Even as you're doing those first couple cards, you need to start thinking about this. Are you trying to stay open and speculate, or are you trying to cut colors for the later rewards? And these are 2 opposing strategies that are worth talking about. The way that color cutting works, and this is something that's probably talked about a lot, and I know probably many of you know what we're going to talk about here, but still I want to break it down for those of you who don't. The idea behind color cutting is this. Imagine I open a pack. I'm the first person to look at the pack. It's a full pack, and there's 1 good red card in it, and then good cards, probably like maybe 2 or 3 good cards in blue, and 2 good cards in green, and 3 good cards in white, and 2 good cards in black. All right. This is maybe the clearest example of that. If I take one of the colors, like black, for example, where there's 2 good cards in that, and then pass that pack to the left, the person to the left is still wide open. He might pick any of those color combinations. Or any of those colors available there, because they have good cards in all of those colors. If I take the good red card, of which there was only 1 good red card in that pack, and then pass that pack to my left, the person on my left doesn't have a good red card in that pack, and they're much less likely to be in red because of that. Now, on one individual pack that might not be so important, maybe for example their pack 1 they had a good red card and I had a good red card in pack 1, and then pack 2 when I pass it to them, or not pack 2, excuse me, the second pack I'm looking at, not the second physically open pack, I pass to them, there's not a good red card in it, that might not push them out of red. But if I consistently pass them packs where there are no good red cards in those packs, it's very unlikely they end up in red. And what that does for me is in pack 2, when the packs are going the other direction, they're likely to leave good red cards in that pack. And then very late, when the packs start rotating all the way around the table, they're less likely to have pulled mediocre red cards out of that pack because they're not playing red, and therefore I will get those mediocre red cards on the rotation all the way around. So the strategy for cutting colors, where you prioritize picking a color that you're playing early and aggressively, is that you get late game payoffs for this, late draft payoffs, where players are leaving stronger cards in that color because they've already committed to colors that aren't your color. That's the point of cutting colors. Now, when you're drafting versus bots in MTG Arena, that may not be so important. They may not read those signals very well, but MTG Arena bot drafting is temporary. The game is eventually going to move to drafting with other players, and every time you draft in person at your local gaming store, or you draft on another client, you're going to be drafting with players. So it's really important to understand kind of what you're looking to do with that. Now, the flip side of this is, if you do something like that, you pick cutting colors, for example, one of the downsides of doing this is you're not speculating. And speculating this is kind of the opposite strategy, or they're both drafting strategies, but it's kind of the opposite way you can approach this early on, which is you just pick the most powerful cards offered to you. This is my preferred strategy. I would like to color cut when I can, but color cutting in the first couple cards in particular is a bit of a luxury that I don't always have to do. I'm looking to craft the most powerful deck I can build out of the cards offered to me. And early, that might mean if I see my first pick is a very powerful red card, I'm going to take that very powerful red card. If my second option is a very powerful blue card, I'm going to take that blue card. My third option is a very powerful green card, I'm probably going to take that green card. And then I'm not color cutting there, so I'm not giving good signals to the person to my left of what's going to happen. And I run the risk of not getting the colors I want returned to me, but what I'm actually doing is picking up good cards and then eventually going to settle down on a color pair from like 3 or 4 or 5 of these picks where I finally have enough in a single color to make a decision about what I'm going to do. So these are kind of strategies a little bit opposing, but both of which you guys should be know about when you're drafting. All right, what cards do you prioritize? When I was introduced to drafting, I was taught the BREAD acronym. The BREAD acronym is bombs, removal, evasion, aggression, and like duds, basically, is the BREAD acronym. I use a slightly modified version of that acronym when I'm looking at cards, and this is basically a quick way to assess, is a card very powerful or not? And you do this, I use the BREAST acronym, and this is bombs and removal, and the 2 slashes there denote basically those are the 2 most important things to me, bombs and removal. And then after that, I look for cards that have evasion, card advantage, synergies, and then eventually trash cards just to fill the curve, basically. The first thing that I often get asked when I talk about this on stream is, how do you know what's a bomb? There is no clear answer to that. The general guide that I look at when I'm looking at what is a bomb is, if this card is unanswered, will it take over the game on its own? So things like really big flyers, a clear bomb like Doom Whisperer, but maybe a less clear bomb, something like a Beast Whisperer. This is a 2/3 creature for 4 mana, but it generates huge amounts of card advantage as you just play your normal cards in a draft. Either of these cards are totally capable of taking over a game on their own, and for me, these cards represent bombs. So when I'm drafting, I'm looking to pick up bombs first, then things like removal, then things like evasion. These are maybe like flyers, like Rock Chargers, an example, an evasive creature. Then things like card advantage, things like maybe a Chemistry's Insight. It's a nice piece of card advantage. Then things like synergies, like Disinformation Campaign. I think I have one of these pulled out already. synergies like that, etc. So that's what I'm doing with that acronym. Those are the type of things I want to think about when I'm drafting for that. All right. Okay. So that's the kind of way to prioritize cards while you're doing that. You should be aware of the payoffs that you get in the guilds that you're looking for. For example, again, we've been through the guilds that are supported in this draft format. I pulled out a couple examples in the deck area over here of payoffs for your colors. I'm going to do Boros last. Boros is kind of the hardest to talk about. But in Selesnya, you're looking for things like this, like Rosemane Centaur or what is it, Siegebreaker Worm. These big creatures that are... they're not generally expensive, but they're not particularly well priced, but they also have Convoke on them. Basically, Selesnya's goal is to throw down a lot of little sticky creatures, 0/4 walls, 1/1s that when they die become other things, cheap creatures, and then use those cheap creatures as sources of mana, basically, to bring out big creatures, a lot of them in quick succession at an accelerated rate, and run your opponent over. It's one of the Selesnya strategies. So this is this type of card, a big dude in Ravnica, and again, this is part of knowing the format you're drafting in. And Ravnica, a 4/4 is a pretty big creature. A 5/5 or 6/6 is a really big creature in this format. There aren't a lot of big creatures in this format, so understanding why this is a Selesnya payoff can help you draft the guild better. Something like Rhizome Lurcher is a Golgari payoff. Golgari is based around building up the graveyard and then taking advantage of things like undergrowth. Rhizome Lurcher is a perfect example of that. This guy often comes out as a 5/5 or a 6/6, which is huge in this format, and that's your goal. Cheap creatures that do stuff on ETBs, like what is that cat called? The something Stray, right? Generous Stray. It's a little body that when it comes in draws you a card, then you chump with it or trade it off to something like Severed Strands maybe, and your goal is to get advantage out of both putting creatures in your graveyard and then the ETBs they have. Things like Burglar Rat is another example of that for types of payoff for Golgari stuff. So, or rather setups for the payoff. So then once you built a deck that synergizes for that, has the cards that will get into the graveyard, you need to have drafted the Golgari payoff cards. If you just have a bunch of creatures that get into the graveyard, but you can't do anything with your graveyard, you're really going to get punished if you start doing something like play Golgari. Izzet wants to take advantage of a higher spell count in their decks. Things like Crackling Drake is a very good example of an Izzet payoff card. If you see this card and you're like, well, where does this really fit in? This fits into an Izzet deck. This is the power payoff for an Izzet deck. And then things like Dimir. Dimir is really going to see the payoff cards with the synergies with Surveilling. Disinformation Campaign is a good example of that. But so are some other things like Thoughtbound Phantasm or, not thoughtful. Thoughtbound Phantasm here is a Dimir payoff card. It has the Surveil synergies, or something like Spybug is another good example of a Dimir payoff card, again with the Surveil synergies. Boros is a little bit harder to see the synergies. Mentoring is certainly one of the core mechanics of Boros, but for me the real payoff cards in Boros are the cards that let me utilize mana in the mid game. So Boros doesn't seem to have a lot of ways to smooth its draw out. Both Surveil and Jumpstart, which is one of the Izzet abilities, both Surveil and Jumpstart really do big things to making your mid game smooth. They let you get rid of excess mana and keep the gas cards, the spell cards coming into your hands. Both Selesnya and Golgari also have mid-game strategies of just running the opponent over, either with cheap creatures or with creatures buffed by how stacked the graveyard is. And then Boros is an aggro deck that really doesn't have a lot of mid-range strategies. Mentoring is again part of an early game kind of run them over strategy. So for me, the Boros payoff cards are the cards that let me utilize my mana in the mid games. Things like Boros Challenger, there's a goblin in this set that it's another example of that, the Banneret. This guy here is a mid game payoff for me for Boros. The Guild Mages are a payoff card for Boros for me. Things like the Legion Guild Mage. Stuff like that lets me take advantage of the fact that as Boros, one of the things I'm really worried about is flooding out in the mid game and not having enough reach to kill them. So cards that give me that little bit of ability to saturate my mana and then reach to kill them are really good for me. Things like Guild Mage, things like Inescapable Blaze, stuff like that. Okay, so let's go back. Keep talking about what we're talking about with that. So Be aware of the guild payoffs when you're drafting. These are important cards to pick up, and they're cards that you might look at once or twice and go, this card's only okay, not realizing that part of the point of building the deck that you're building is to capitalize on those payoffs, and you need to draft those at a fairly reasonable rate. All right, I talked already about the BREST acronym, talked about what they are. If some new players have asked me, what does evasion mean? Evasion is things like flying or menace. It's basically creatures that are particularly hard to block so that they are more likely to get damage in. For example, unblockables, flyers, menace creatures, creatures with death touch are sometimes this way because your opponent often doesn't want to block them because they trade very efficiently, things like this. Card advantage we talked about for drawing. All right, so another question that gets asked a lot when I'm streaming is when to splash. So splashing is, let's say you're further enough along in the draft that you've identified you're going to be playing Dimir, so you're going to be playing blue-black. But you're starting to see a couple decent cards in another color, maybe green. When to splash? Well, splashing is a power level versus consistency thing. The downside of splashing, if you had perfect mana base, if all your mana tapped for any color, you would never be forced to commit to any color pair. You could just play the most strong cards that you have drafted, and that would be great. That would be what you'd want to do with that. So the decision you're making every time you decide whether or not you want to splash another color is the card that I'm going to splash for a powerful enough impact on my deck to make it good enough to deal with the fact that my mana base gets less consistent. And Ravnica offers a lot of ways to fix your mana. District Guide, Dual Lands, Circuitous Route, the Chromatic Lantern, the Gateway Plaza. There's a lot of ways to fix your mana in Ravnica. So splashing is definitely something you can do reliably, but even those have a cost. Almost all of those cards are tempo, negative tempo, right? So if you bring in a land that's tapped instead of untapped, that gives you one less mana source to work with on that turn. If you add too many tap lands and you play against a very fast Boros aggro deck, for example, you won't have enough resources to fight back. So the decision you make when you splash a color is how powerful is your deck going to be versus how consistent and how fast is it going to be is basically the decision you're making. So that can't be answered as a generic it is or isn't good to splash. It has to be answered on a card-to-card basis with the deck that you've already built. And perhaps one of the reasons you might splash is you're seeing fairly mediocre cards in your color pair and you're worried about the overall strength of your deck. You're like, this deck is okay, but it's not going to win because if it runs into an opponent having too many powerful cards, I have no answers to these. I need some powerful cards too. And then if you start seeing powerful cards in another color, sometimes it's worth picking those up and splashing for that. It's easier to splash some colors than it is others. The colors that are related are easier to splash. So if you're Golgari, and you splash blue for Dimir, that's fairly easy to do. The black and blue share a guild in Ravnica, so it's easier to do. But if you're playing Izzet and trying to splash, what would it be? Green, then you're going to have some trouble because neither blue nor red share a color pair with green in that scenario. So some of it is thinking about, well, which guilds are easier to splash for the guild I'm playing? Which colors are easier to splash for the guild I'm playing? And some of it is identifying what types of cards are easy to splash. The general way to look at that is their total converted mana cost and the number of mana symbols they use of the color you're splashing. For example, this card is really good in... oops, what am I looking for? I'm looking for an Electromancer. Should have pulled this down earlier. So a Goblin Electromancer is a really good Izzet card. Very, very synergetic with casting lots of spells. It's quite a little powerful creature. It's a 2/2 for 2 with a really nice extra ability. It's also very, very hard to splash. And the reason why it's very hard to splash is because it is a 2-drop. Its converted mana cost is 2. You tend to want to play 2 mana cards very early, and you don't have time to draw a mana source that you don't have very many copies of in your deck. Now, the flip side of that is something like the Affectionate Indrik. Affectionate Indrik is very easy to splash because you're never going to want to play this card. Well, you might want to play it before this, but you can never play it before turn 6 because you need 6 mana sources for it. And even then, because it's situational, you might not always want to slam a 4/4 onto the board. You might want to try to get a value out of its enter the battlefield effect. You're not even always going to want to cast it on turn 6. You might want to cast it more like turn 7 or turn 8 when it has a good target on there. So one of the things to think about is the converted mana cost of the card. It's easier to splash higher mana cost cards because you don't need to cast them until later, which gives you time to draw the sources of that mana for in your deck. So if you're, for example, if you're playing black and blue and you're splashing Indrix for some late game removal, you have plenty of time to draw a green mana source, even though it's a minority mana source in your deck. The other thing to look at is the number of mana symbols on a card. So Deadly Visit is harder to splash than Affectionate Indrik, both because its converted mana cost is a little bit lower, but also because it requires 2 black sources as opposed to 1 green source. So if I'm playing a deck that is not main color black and I want to splash a Deadly Visit because I need some removal, I have to draw 2 swamps or 2 sources of black mana before I'm able to cast it, as opposed to 1, which makes that a lot less consistent. So the easiest cards to splash are high converted mana cost, low mana symbol cards. All right, I think that's fairly clear. Let's go back to the main page here. All right. So what's a splashable card? We talked about. Another thing to think about when you're drafting is know what you're aiming for. I'm going to give you some very, very rough guidelines and then talk about all the ways in which this isn't accurate. You're looking for 23 playables. You want a 40-card deck, and you generally want to break that down into 23 playables and 17 lands. There's good math for this elsewhere. I'm not going to get into it right now, but basically, this is what people who are better at math than you or I have sat down and worked out is what you're looking for an optimal amount of land. This changes on your deck. If the converted mana cost of your deck is very, very low, the average converted mana cost, you may go down to 16 or in some very, very extreme rare scenarios, 15 lands. But most of the time, you're aiming for about 17 lands. You want roughly 15 creatures. This one is a lot more variable. If you're a very heavy aggro deck, you may want more, like 17 or 18 even. And if you are playing Izzet in this format, which is very, very has a lot of spell synergies and is very reliant on having jumpstart cards in their deck, you may go down to like 11 or 12 creatures. But in general, you're aiming for roughly 15 plus or minus probably 4 creatures in a deck. So as you're drafting, especially as you get into the later stages of the draft, your priorities are going to change based on what you need to aim for. If you don't have 23 playables, you need to stop speculating and start nailing down what you're going to be playing. If you don't have 12 or 13 creatures in a deck that is like a Golgari or a Dimir deck or something, you might have to pass stronger cards that are spell cards to pick up stronger creature cards, because you just have to have a basic amount of creatures. You also need to be aware of your curve. It's all good and well to pick up a bunch of very strong, like 5 or 6 mana drop cards, but if you don't have 1s or 1, 2s, 3s, and 4s to get you to that stage of the game and have enough that you can reliably play them in the early game, you're just going to get out-tempoed by other decks and not have any chance to play your strong cards. So it's also important to, from time to time, sort your deck by curve and make sure that you're drafting enough low drops to go with your strong cards. And in the same vein, if you're overdrafting low drops, you need to make sure you have some way to close the game out to make sure you can win the game. I don't have it on this list, but I should probably add it here. I also look for win conditions when I draft. So from time to time, I might look at my deck and go, one of the creatures that really comes to mind when I'm thinking about this is something like I'll show you, see if I can find, I think it's a Bartizan Bat. Is that, well, it's, yeah, this dude here. This card is fairly unimpressive. It's a 4 mana for a 3/1 flyer. It's very fragile, dies fairly easily. It's not that great, but a lot of times that this actually becomes what I consider one of the cards that would be a win condition for my deck. I might have a pretty solid black-blue deck with good early game, decent amount of removal, but it's lacking either big creatures or evasive creatures to actually kill my opponent. It's too easy for my opponent to lock up the ground, and I don't really have a way to win. This card becomes a little bit more exciting for me then, because it represents a source of evasive damage that is likely to get in again and again, especially if I have removal to clear the way for it, and will actually kill my opponent over a period of time. So as you're drafting, make sure you keep your eye out for the curve of your deck, but also that you have enough win conditions to do something. You might end up picking up guys you would not normally always want to play, like Bartizan Bats, or even sometimes like Dowser of Lights is another good example of this creature. 4/5 for 5 is not particularly exciting, except that it represents in this format a big enough creature that you can sometimes just win games by attacking them repeatedly with this creature. And your deck needs ways to win in the end. All right. Okay, so also don't forget your sideboard as you're drafting decks. It's really important to think about the fact that you will, if you're playing competitive constructed, and this is again, knowing your format. If you're playing competitive constructed, you'll play the best of 3 games versus each opponent. If you're playing quick draft, you only play the best of 1, and you won't have a sideboard, so you don't have to draft for that. But sometimes you might pass a mediocre playable that might be, you might be at the stage you're picking it, like your 23rd or 22nd or 21st playable, but you expect to get better, more powerful cards to replace that doing the same role in your deck, and there's a sideboard card that is situationally very good, but maybe not immediately good. Cards that come to mind for that are things like Crushing Canopy, which you may or may not want a main deck rather, which is a anti-enchantment or anti-flyer piece of damage dealing, or Collar the Culprit is another example of a sideboard card that you might end up picking this over like your a lesser power 2-drop or lesser power 3-drop, even though you're not putting it in your main deck because you're building a sideboard to deal with the threats that your opponent's deck may put out, but not threats that are always there. Situational cards are very good for sideboard cards. All right. And then finally, let's talk about some common mistakes that you run into when you're drafting that I see other players do a lot and have made myself as a newer drafter. Things like committing too early. We talked about cutting colors versus staying open and speculating. This is not something you can be, there's no exact science to when you need to commit to colors or how to read what colors are open, but it's very easy to get a good pick early. Let's say your first pick's a red card and your second pick's a white card, and both of them are pretty good. And then from pack 2 onwards, from pack 3 onwards, in your head, you've now got it that you're playing Boros and you're only drafting white and red cards. You can put on blinders that way and miss signals that some other colors are open. Maybe you picked a good red card early, you got a good white card in the second pack, and then there aren't a lot of good white cards coming around after that. Maybe that what that actually means as you keep looking at the cards being passed to you, that Izzet is open but not Boros. And you will hurt the overall power level of your deck if you are fighting with other players for playable cards in your colors. What will happen is they'll pick good playable cards and you'll pick good playable cards, and there won't be enough good playables to go around, and the overall power level of your deck decreases. So committing too early is often a mistake. Try to stay open if you can. Cut the cards if you know that these cards are good cards and you want to represent this color and set that up. But sometimes it's worth picking a card that you're not sure you're going to play because it is potentially a card you might play, because it's better than being locked down to colors where you're only going to get mediocre cards and it's a stronger card. Not moving, this is kind of on a related note, not moving to an open color. If maybe you got your first couple picks were good white cards, and then no good white card comes again. You know, you're on pack 7 or 8 or 9, and it's just like there just aren't good white cards showing up in the packs you're looking at. But you're seeing, again, let's use the Boros example. You started with 1 red card, then picked up 2 good white cards. You're thinking you're in Boros, but then no good white cards are coming. You get the occasional good red card, and you're seeing a lot of blue cards in there as well. Maybe like Goblin Electromancer is what I keep looking at here. Izzet might be open where Boros isn't, and it's really important to kind of pay attention to the cards being passed to you. Every card that gets passed to you is someone else deciding that they didn't want that card for their deck. And they might decide they didn't want that card for their deck because they had a more powerful card of a similar color combination. That's certainly possible. But it's also likely that they passed that card because that card may be good, especially if it's a late card and it's good, may be good, but it's not in the colors they're playing, and therefore they can't use it. And those are the colors you want to be in, are the colors that other players aren't playing, because then you're going to get the most number of powerful cards passed that way. All right. Another common mistake I see is not understanding the format, or maybe another way to look at that is not evaluating cards in the context of the format. 2 cards that really came to mind for me for that are Child of Night and Rock Charger. This has now been, I've played 3 formats. I've played Dominaria, I've played M19, and I've played Ravnica, right? Rock Charger has been in all 3 of those. It was called Pegasus Courser in Dominaria and M19, but it's now called Rock Charger in Ravnica. But it's the same card. It's been in all 3 of those formats, and it's different in each of those formats. In Dominaria, it is a mediocre card. It's not bad, but it's not amazing. There's a lot of 3/2 flyers or 3 power flyers out there, and oftentimes you can block the Charger and kill it very efficiently, and that's not a great card to have in Dominaria. It's still good, but not amazing. In M19 and in Ravnica, this card is very good. There aren't a lot of things that easily trade with it early, so opponent either has to remove it, or opponent has to deal with the fact that you now have 2 evasive creatures. The Charger lifts off somebody else, and it's a pain in the ass to deal with. This card is very good in Ravnica and M19. It's the same card. Its strength is relative to the other cards that you're going to be playing against in the draft. Same with Child of Night. This card is an M19 card. It's really, really unexciting. There's a lot of 1/3 creatures in M19. There's a good number of ways to deal 1 damage cheaply. The creature is very, very weak in that format. It doesn't get a lot of value. It's quite a bit better in Ravnica. It's a totally reasonable blocker to bring in versus aggro. It often will trade either equal mana cost and get you some life, or maybe let you get a couple attacks in and race a little bit more efficiently. It's a totally decent card in Ravnica and a totally garbage card in M19. And that is understanding the format. And there's no perfect way to do that except play more games and have that in context. But when you're evaluating cards, be careful you don't bring in too much baggage from previous sets you've drafted. Because although there is information to be had from playing this card in another set, the power level of the card is totally contextual to the other cards in that set. All right. So just a quick recap of what we talked about here. Be aware of the set you're drafting in and the specifics of that set. Pay attention to what you're doing early, the signals you're sending players further downstream about what colors you're cutting and what colors you're passing along. Be aware that the upside of staying open and speculating is you pick up high power cards and potentially can switch those into your deck and have a higher powered deck. The downside is the consistency of having multiple cards, of getting enough playables, and of the signals you're sending to players further down the line. Be aware of what cards to prioritize. A lot of that is experience based, but if you are ever in doubt and looking for just a heuristic to look to, remember the BREST acronym. You're looking for bombs, removal, evasion, advantage, synergy, and then basically filler cards. Be aware of the fact that splashing is both increased power for your deck, but decreased consistency. There are certainly times you're going to want to do it, and be aware how the easier ways to splash are the colors that share a guild with your existing guilds, because those are the ones you're going to have multiple fixing sources for it. And then finally, be aware of what the deck is that you're trying to build. You're trying to build a deck with a curve that has X number of playables, 23 playables, 15 creatures roughly, and 17 lands. All right, so as I said, this is the theory piece. Hopefully it was useful, and I will be doing a over-explained draft as a second part of this where I really go through my picks and why I've chosen them. Thanks for watching, guys. See you soon.